Ladies and gentlemen, it gives me a great deal of pleasure to welcome you all here to this Q&A event this afternoon. I'm really excited about this event. My name's Grant, by the way. I'm the President of the Victorian branch of the Australian Association for Religious Education. And as I say, this is the first time we've tried something like this, and I'm truly excited by the prospect of what lies ahead, because I think anything that encourages conversation across various faiths has got to be a positive. So that's really at the core of what we're about this afternoon. Before going any further, I'd like to introduce Lila McInerney, who's one of the Deputy Principals here at Genazzano, who have very graciously agreed to host us this afternoon. And I'd like to ask Lila just to bring us a welcome on behalf of the school. Thank you.
Thanks, Grant. At Genazzano, before we begin any occasion, we acknowledge that we stand on land for which the Wurundjeri people are the traditional custodians. We remember their forebears with respect and commit ourselves to working for reconciliation and justice. On behalf of our college principal, Mrs. Patricia Cowling, who is unable to be with us this afternoon as she's in another meeting, it's a very warm welcome that I extend to every one of you here today. It's a privilege for us here at Genazzano to host this afternoon's forum, because I think there's so many things that we have in common as educators in school, but one of them is that we always are trying to challenge our students to question and to enter into dialogue. And I think that's what this afternoon's about, entering into dialogue. So as educators, if we can't do what it is that we're trying to constantly encourage our students to do, then that's the greatest witness, as we know. What we do is for them. So a warm welcome to Genazzano. If there's anything we can do for you, please let us know. But it's been a privilege to work in particular with Laurie and Grant and Richard and Julie, and we hope you enjoy being with us as much as we enjoy hosting you. So thank you.
Now, just before I introduce Julie, who's going to facilitate the discussion this afternoon, just a word about the camera that's there in the background. Cameras are filming, and that's what that camera is doing, and Richard's behind it. If anybody has an objection to appearing on this film, which is likely to end up on our website at some point, could you just raise your hand if you don't want to appear on this film? Then Richard will make a mental note of that and ensure that you do not appear. No, you're not allowed. It's my great pleasure to introduce to you Julie Perrin. We were delighted when Julie accepted our invitation to facilitate this forum this afternoon. Julie has taught across secondary and also tertiary sectors as an arts educator. She's spent time as a school chaplain with Access Ministries at Blackburn High School. She's had a sustained interest in oral storytelling and completed a Masters of Education at the University of Melbourne, looking at the reciprocal roles of the teller, the tale and the listeners. She's an active member of the Brunswick Uniting Church, and now she directs her own business, aptly named Telling Words. And as I said, we're delighted to welcome Julie, and I'm going to hand it over to her. Thank you, Julie.
Thank you very much. Well, it's good to be here at last. We're in the room. And I'd like to begin by acknowledging who's in the room. In a moment, I'll introduce our panellists, who we're very thrilled to have with us. But here, amongst the listeners, are people from country Victoria. Have I got that right? Did they get here? Yes, good. People from independent schools and state schools. Do you want to wave your hand if you're from an independent school? And from a state school? Yes, good. And we have people here from, someone here, Danny, from the Jewish Student... United Jewish Education Board? UGEM. And we also have from the Rationalist Society, Meredith Doig. Thank you, Meredith. And we'll have questions from across the room and from different people during the session. Is there anyone who would particularly like to alert me to their presence if they're from an organisation that I've overlooked? I'm really hoping that this afternoon will feel like a conversation. And a conversation in the spirit which a very interesting new contemporary writer called Susan Scott, who wrote a book called Fierce Conversations, talks about conversation being not something that is in opposition, but where we together look at something. And I'm hoping that we can come together today in the spirit of not for a debate about, having to sort of have any kind of one-upmanship or proving ourselves to be right, but really listening. And I've been delighted to meet all of the speakers on the panel over the phone, and I'm very confident that that's going to be their attitude. And I think one of the things that's always good to remind ourselves of is the art of listening. It's a really underrated activity in contemporary society, and it is a very active thing. I'm very aware, because I work with oral language education, that it's really about bodies in space. And it's about how we communicate our listening via our bodies as much as anything else that will enable what can be told. Because a lot of what will be said today will be couched in narrative. And the stories that are able to be told will be enabled by the way that we listen to them. So it's a very active engagement, and I hope that you'll feel that and that you'll find a place for your voice in this conversation as well. So very briefly, I'm going to introduce our speakers. There have been a few amusing moments where people have talked about, because Q&A has sort of entered the parlance since Tony Jones made it famous, and I need to acknowledge that. Two things. One is that this is the first panel and event of this kind that's been organised by the AARE. And also, it's the first time I've hosted an interfaith event. So no pressure, but I'm not going to be Tony Jones, I'm sorry. But I think we are in for some really interesting sharing of ideas and experiences. And I think I'll just go down the row introducing you, starting with Helen. I'm really delighted that Helen has been able to accept this invitation. When I first met her over the phone, well, I actually met you quite some time ago through a marvellous event that Helen organised that was part of the Melbourne Writers' Festival. I don't know if any of you attended when Coleman Barks presented the poetry of Rumi, that famous Sufi poet. But Helen was behind mobilising that event, and I, for one, have been eternally grateful to her for that marvellous introduction. But Helen is an interfaith minister, and she established in the year 2000 the Interfaith Centre of Melbourne, and has access to and supports and offers events that basically are open to and represent and allow a voice for, was it 130 different faith groups in Victoria?
According to the census.
According to the census. Now, Helen doesn't claim that she has to speak for each one, but she has a very broad vision and a concern that our view of God is not too small. And I think you couldn't be in her position with a small view. So it's wonderful to have her here. She does, when I spoke to her on the phone, she was quick to point out that she's not currently working in an educational context. But I think it's a really good voice that she'll have for us today. And she does have background, was at one point Professor of Adult Education at the Bond University. So I think she's being too modest, really. Now, what I should do is pass this microphone over and make sure that it's actually turned on. Is this working? Yes. This is working? So I'm going to put this here so that when the urge to speak comes upon you, unfortunately we just have the one to share because we're sharing one amongst the audience as well. Next to Helen is Gersh Lazaro, and Gersh is currently, and until Friday, the rabbi of King David's School. And on Friday, he will become the...
Monday, please, then.
Sorry. You told me Friday.
My Sabbath, your Sabbath,
Yeah.
plenty of time.
As of next week, he will have the role of being rabbi of the largest synagogue in Australia, Temple Beth Israel. The congregation that actually founded the King David School. And Gersh has a really impressive CV. I think if he was hanging his degrees on the wall, there'd be 3 MAs amongst them. In fact, I think just about everyone here has got a slew of those things, but we don't need to get too distracted by that. When I was talking to Gersh, he was really eloquent about the experiential nature of the teaching that he does about the faith tradition in the school and how important the really tangible experience of the students is. And I'd love you to give some of the examples that you gave me, Gersh, when you speak. So we look forward to hearing some of those really eloquent ways about teaching a living Judaism. Next to Gersh is Adele Salman, and we're delighted that Adele is here. I think, Adele, that at the moment you are, and maybe this will be the only time at one of these events, but I think you might be the only Muslim in the room. It's, yeah. The fantastic thing is that Adele has said very clearly that he is very, very passionate about this role of communicating about his faith tradition in the community. He has a very high-flying day job, but his passion, he tells me, is absolutely for the community engagement of teaching the Muslim faith tradition. And to that end, he's been very involved with setting up teaching and getting all of the accreditation for putting voluntary teachers into state schools in Victoria. And so at the moment there are several in Dandenong South and Meadows, out near Broadmeadows, that are actually having the Muslim faith taught to the students by their trained volunteer teachers in the similar way that Access Ministries has for a long time done Christian religious education. And Adele tells me that Access Ministries were actually quite helpful in the setting up of the necessary structures for that to happen and assisted him in that, as well as, of course, the body, the Islamic Council of Victoria, that he's also connected with. So we're delighted to have you. There's a beautiful website that you might like to go to that is called Arkan Toledo, that talks about the organisation that Adele has helped to structure and set up in order to teach in the primary schools. So I do recommend that you go to that. And I think we might have to have a way of gathering some of these websites and connections and putting them perhaps on the website of ARE after this event. So welcome, Adele. And now we have the double act from MLC. In the white scarf is Janet Munro, who has been at MLC for 7 years and taught, was ordained as a deacon in the Uniting Church, and this has been her enduring placement and deep love. She has an abiding interest in children's spirituality. She is the chaplain to the junior school and junior secondary at MLC and is team leader of the teaching of religious education in those parts of the school. And next to her is Belinda Buchanan, who is the top end of the school. And Belinda's been at the school a shorter time, 3 years, but she comes out of the Catholic education system prior to this and has for a long time taught religion and society and is an assessor in that subject. And she's particularly interested and said some very beautiful things that I hope will come out in the conversation in the transmission of values and religious ideas and the challenges about how do we, in a school environment with all of its structures and organisational sort of vetoes, how do we communicate these things that matter to us at a deeply human level, and how do we do it in a way that students can access and want to engage with? And so Belinda's got some interesting questions to raise. That's going to be about it from me for now. I'm going to ask a question for each of the panel to respond to, just by way of introducing themselves. And it's a double-barrelled question. And the only thing I'm going to warn you about is that in the interests of all the voices possible being heard, I am going to be a bit of a clock watcher, and I may interrupt people, all right? So just, I apologise in advance if I'm rude to anyone, but my purpose will be to keep the discussion moving. So hopefully that's the longest spiel you'll hear from me all day. And the question I'd love to put to people, and perhaps to begin with, we might start with you, Helen, is what would you most like us to know about your context, and why does this conversation matter to you in the faith tradition and organisation you come from?
Well, first, is this on? Can you hear me?
Ice cream.
Is that
Yeah.
better?
Yes, that's better.
Okay, thank you. Just let me know if you can't hear me. I'd just like to make a correction. I wasn't professor of adult education, but an assistant professor in the School of Humanities at Bond University, and taught teaching and learning methodology for language learning and teaching, and also at RMIT. And then took a very different career path to become an interfaith minister in New York. And I just wanted to mention that briefly, because for a lot of people they've never heard of an interfaith minister. But while I lived in New York for 6 years, I met Rabbi Joseph Gelberman, who had started the new seminary for interfaith ministers about 20 years before I met him in 1992. And he had lost his young wife and baby daughter in the Holocaust. And he was in New York, he couldn't get back to Europe, and together later with a Catholic Protestant minister and a priest and a Buddhist monk and a Swami, they set up the new seminary so that we could all learn to talk to each other and understand each other's religions and traditions. And so that is a little bit about interfaith ministry. And interfaith ministers work in many different fields. I came from a background in education, so when I returned to Melbourne, I saw that there wasn't very much happening in 1998 when I returned in the interfaith area. There was the Council for Christians and Jews, which is very old and established, but there weren't many programs for the general public. And there was Religions for Peace, which at that time had no programs at all for the general public. And so I, together with a group of friends, we formed a committee and set up the Interfaith Centre of Melbourne. So we try to bring about more understanding between people of different faith and no faith through the arts and through seminars, through educational programs. I haven't taught in, well, I did actually teach in a school in New York, now I come to think of it, but I haven't really taught interfaith studies in schools at all. So I'm coming from a very different background, but I hope maybe some of the ideas that we have and programs that we have run might be of interest to you. So I'm very interested in coming today because I would like to see students in schools, whether it's primary or secondary schools, learning more about each other's religious traditions, because we do need to have that social cohesion. We need to break down a lot of the misunderstandings and the barriers that are between us. And we need to look at what we hold in common. There are many different things, as you probably already know, that we hold in common. And we can learn about the differences and respect them. We don't have to accept each other's differences, but we can respect them, we can understand them. And for people of no faith, no religious faith, we all share as human beings those ethics and morals. As His Holiness the Dalai Lama says, you don't have to be religious to be a good person. And there are probably many religious people who are not good people. So the only way we can do this is to learn from each other and to have sessions such as today.
Beautiful. That's good. Perfect. Thank you very much. I'll hand on to Gersh.
So I come from a, if there is another side of that coin, I suppose the flip side of that coin, heading in the same direction, but from a totally opposite perspective. I am a particularist. I practice Judaism for Jews. Jews for Judaism is a club I have within our school. And why do I do that? Because I fundamentally believe that the more I can enable the communities I work with, now within the school, soon to be the congregation, better understand themselves, better understand their story, their stories. There isn't ever a single story. Their stories that bring them to time and place. The more I can deepen, help them find meaning in who they are and what they do, the more I equip them to go out into this remarkable society we're privileged to live in and be ready and willing to dialogue with other people. My lived experience is that most of my friends, most of my family, unfortunately most of my students and even most of my colleagues don't engage in interfaith dialogue, not because they have concerns or fears about the other, but rather they simply don't have the skills, ability or confidence to talk about themselves. So we spend a lot of time at the King David School talking about living Judaism. And we use, as you spoke about, my passion for experiential learning. We pull back wherever possible to the primary cause of core aspects of culture, of practice, and use these as entry points into theology, belief and faith for those who choose to take them there. There are many that choose to simply leave it, arrive at that point, get a deeper understanding of culture, history and ritual, and leave it there. But by encouraging people to come to know themselves, their stories and the world in which they live, we enable them to then engage in dialogue. And the culmination of that at our school is I think I was trying to count after we spoke on the phone. There are 5 interfaith programs we have at different year levels at our school, where we have, again, not enough of our students, but a lot more than we ever had in the past, engaged in, for example, the Building Bridges program, where they dialogue with people of different faith traditions. And the hardest part of that, without exception, this is, part of this conversation is about being honest about who we are. For my students, the hardest part about building bridges is not when they go visit another school and learn about a different tradition. The hardest part about being part of this network, this dialogue, is when they stand up on the bima, the stage, in our prayer space, in our school, and talk about themselves. It's the time I see most of my teenagers engage in a relationship with the God, because they have the fear of God in their lives, and that's not the relationship I want them having with God or with Judaism, and so that's really my story, and as it happens, my journey is taking me out of school. I always thought I'd be in school. I actually began in camping, in summer camping. I also had the privilege of having my horizons broadened in North America. I was on the other coast. In these unique communities of meaning. Camping is that, school is that, where we can create an artificial reality. But I move now to the congregation, but in appointing me and giving me the opportunity to move into the congregation, what it's also clearly saying about my community, and Yarra, I represent the progressive Jewish community, the theological left, the political left of the Jewish spectrum. They're ready, willing and able to engage in that same conversation about finding meaning.
I loved it, Gersh, when you said on the phone that you felt part of your role in a progressive Jewish school was disarming secularism. And I think a lot of religious educators would identify with that sense of having to disarm that kind of defended stance.
It's really interesting that you picked up on that piece. I've been doing a lot of work with a number of the leading sociologists within Jewish community study. There was recently, only a half dozen years ago, a massive survey done, the best survey done of demographics in Jewish community. And I was introduced to this entirely new concept. Wasn't new to me, wasn't new to any of my friends of other faith traditions. It's called sono, the term that the sociologists use. Strictly orthodox and non-observant. They have a very fixed idea of what organised religion is, and they know they want no part of it. And for me, that's where I imagine I'll be spending the great majority of my professional future. Engaging with people that have determined on a very fixed idea about a religion that I don't practice.
It's a good note to finish on. Thank you, Gersh and Adele. Before you start, Adele, there's one little announcement I failed to make, and I could be severely embarrassed by this. I was going to ask people to turn their phones to silent if they hadn't already, and I will do the same. So if you do have a phone in your bag and would like to fish it out and put it to silent so it doesn't ring at the wrong moment, that would be wonderful. Adele.
Hello, and thank you. I feel very fortunate to be on a panel such as this. It's a very interesting panel, and I'm listening to Helen and Gersh speak, and I'm probably the odd one out in the sense that I'm not directly involved in the promulgation of Islam or the Islamic faith or interfaith. I've been involved to some degree. I'm involved in special religious instruction in schools, and I do engage with various Islamic organisations around Islamic community work, but I don't have a direct role. And I think, as Julie mentioned, I have a day job, but I'm far more interested in the work that I do outside of normal hours. My context, and I don't know if this was intentional or just pure coincidence, but my context is somewhere in between Helen and Gersh, in the sense that, or maybe it's a complement of both, in the sense that my interest lies in talking to non-Muslims, whether that be people of other faiths or no faith, about Islam. What it actually means to be a Muslim in Australia or in a Western context. And it also encompasses talking to Muslims about what it means to be an Australian Muslim. So there's an inward focus, and I think you were talking, Gersh, about the living experience, certainly from an Islamic context or a Muslim context, of what does it mean to live and practice Islam in Australia. But there's a very strong focus in my mind on the need to engage with society. And I don't think anyone in this room would question why I say that. I think Islam is very much front and centre in so many different debates and discussions, whether it be about values. Are Islamic values compatible with Western secular values, liberal democracy, etc., etc.? Whether it be about national security, whether it be about can we apply Sharia law, or are there people asking for the application of Sharia law in Australia? And all parts in between, and all points in between. So there's no question that Islam, by the fact or because of the events that have transpired over the last quarter of a century, is very much a subject of discussion, quite heated discussion, and I think it's fair to say a lot of misunderstanding and ignorance. So I'm hoping that today I can help shed some light on some of the issues that you may have or some of the questions that you may have, and I said this to Julie when we spoke, that I would much rather you ask me the difficult questions than not ask because you're afraid perhaps of being controversial or offending me in some way. And again, as I said to Julie, as long as the discussion happens in the context of mutual respect, then you can ask me any question that you like. about Islam, and obviously subject to time, and I'm more than happy to have that discussion and more than happy to also to take questions from my fellow panellists. But I guess that's my context, and as I said, I'm very happy to be here today, and I think I agree that there should be more of this, these forums, because I think that certainly will help break down some of the very strong misconceptions, misunderstandings, and I'm afraid to say enmity that does exist as well. Thank you.
Adele, thank you. And can I comment, one of the memorable things that Adele said to me that interestingly ties with something Gersh also said, is that you said that a lot of what you're teaching towards and wanting the Arkan Toledo to support in the schools is teaching children about being an Australian Muslim, and that focus on the awareness of, in this culture, the expression of it. And a lovely image I had from Gersh was when you described the school logo of a harp, the Harp of David in the wattle. And so let's just keep this awareness of we're situating ourselves in this place. And I was really delighted when Lila instantly and without question acknowledged Indigenous spirituality and the Indigenous heritage on the land in which we meet. And I carry with me always a little piece of cloth with, and as you can see, some clapping sticks that I've got over there. And you'll also notice there's just a piece of Indian cloth because we don't have anyone from the Hindu religion represented here today, but I just thought some little visual acknowledgements might be good. And perhaps I'll throw in just a tiny piece of my experience as a religious educator. When I was at Blackburn High School, I was teaching Year 7 religious education, and people were very anxious to know that I was not just going to teach my own tradition and force my views on the students. And so I found myself, teaching about other faith traditions on a very thin level of knowledge. And memorably, I got back, a little test from Year 7 religious education class, where a student had written with great authority that Buddhists find peace through medication.
We all do.
Yes. So, thank you, Adele. It's great to have you here. And I've set such a low bar. You could all feel very accomplished now in comparison. Thanks, Janet.
Thank you, Julie. Adele just said that he felt like he was the odd one out. I feel a bit of an odd one out at the moment. I don't know why, but I just do. My name's Janet Munro, and I'm, as Julie said, I'm a Uniting Church minister. But increasingly, I have to say, in the context that I work in, because I work in a very diverse context in regards to culture, tradition, values, religious experience or none, that increasingly I find myself as an interfaith minister, because I see my role as chaplain as nurturing the spirituality of the young people that I work with. And that means taking seriously the stories that have shaped them, and that will be very different for each young person. Obviously, the Christian faith is my story, is part of my story, and it's been a story that has shaped me to be the person that I am today. It's a story that I hold incredibly dearly, and a story that I've committed my life to. But I also know that I learn every single day from the young people that I work with. And I think that for me, that has been the growing experience for me, is how much I learn from the children that I spend my time with, particularly the very young children. I would have to say that I've learnt more from, and I have to thank Paul for giving me his preps when he left MLC, that I've learnt more from my preps than I probably have from anybody else in the school, that they have opened my eyes to new ways of seeing things. And so it's actually been that experience that has really encouraged me to look further into this area of children's spirituality. And I guess what I've discovered in the research and the reading that I've done is that it's connected, absolutely connected with my experience in working with these young children. and that there just seems to be this innate capacity for spirituality in young children. And I see the difference between prep and year one. And I don't know if there's anyone else here that actually works with that age group, but I see a distinct difference between children in prep to children in year one, that by year one you start to see the effects of socialisation. That suddenly they are starting to tell you things that are obviously not of their own imagination, but have come from their parents, have come from their culture, have come from their television watching in particular. And so that has fascinated me. And I guess what I'm really interested in is actually looking at what very young children can teach adults and teach older people about how we might nurture our spirituality. So that's something that's been really important to me. The other thing that I've really love about my role as chaplain, just a few years ago I started, actually it's probably about 5 years ago now, I started a faith and worship team, and they meet with me. They're a group of Year 6 students who meet with me once a week to plan our chapel services. And I take anyone who applies, but I do ask them to submit an application. And really it's for their own benefit of really thinking through why they want to do this. And more, I find within I had a group of 6 when I first started. This year I've got a group of 25. So it's 25 Year 6s who want to be involved in the preparation and leadership of our chapel services. And those girls will say things like, I don't come from any religious tradition, but I think it's really important, the things that we learn in chapel. Again and again, children will say that sort of thing. And so they can obviously see that there is a place for everybody in our chapel services. So even though, as I said, I'm a Christian minister, but for me it's really important that there's the opportunity for every young person to be able to make some sort of connection when they come into that space. So I make sure there's opportunities for really exploring things like religious festivals from other traditions, anything that might, all sorts of things that are on television, secular music, all sorts of things that might find an opportunity for our young people to connect. But working with the young people has enabled us to do that, because they're the ones that really get that.
So there's really student initiation going on of...
Absolutely,
yeah,
absolutely.
Beautiful. Thank you. Thanks, Janet. And we'll have Belinda last down the line.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. My role is quite different, I think, from Janet's role in MLC. I'm one of the student coordinators at Year 10 level, so I think part of my context that has some bearing today is the idea of looking at the overview of well-being of the students from lots of different aspects. But I also have a role as one of the religious educators, teaching Year 9, 10 and 11, and not 12 this year, sadly. But I've been involved for quite some time with teaching religion and society. So from that perspective, I guess the context is more of seeing myself as a religious educator that teaches it from the phenomenon of religion perspective, looking at religion quite broadly, and then bringing it home to our Christian tradition. I think the coming back to the context of the well-being of students overall, I think one of the pressing things is the expectations that are still quite high in this area. Looking at our flowchart of student well-being and the different strands of well-being that the school tries to address, there's 5 different branches. There's the cognitive area, there's the physical area, there's social area, the social, the interpersonal, intrapersonal areas, emotional sort of areas of their life. And then the 5th strand is actually the spirituality of students. And I think that it's there's still a high expectation that somehow we are responsible for, and we are trying to meet some spiritual needs that students have. So there's still that understanding that those spiritual needs are there and that we should be addressing those. And, you know, I know that when we think about us coming from a faith-based founded school, independent school, that, you know, that's probably fairly apparent that there's going to be some expectation about the spirituality and the spiritual needs of students. But in this day and age, we're not really in a setting where that's very easily addressed. We've moved away, I think, fairly resoundingly from a catechetical model, a formative sort of model of we want to turn out, you know, little whatevers, whatever religion the school may be, to something else. But I'm not sure that we've actually filled that hole with what else. So I feel that we're in a position of having high expectations and not yet having the resources or the means to try to address those. When I think about my own spirituality as a young person, I actually had all of my primary and secondary education in the state system in a little country school in Western Australia. So we had RI once a year for a week, just one session a day for a week. And I was christened Catholic, and so I was on the books as being in the Catholic class. But my mum went to a little evangelical church in the town, so I used to sneak in with the evangelicals because there was better music. And they usually sent somebody younger. I'm sorry to say that. But I do remember the day when somebody came around and called all of the Catholics out and said, "Get back to where you belong." So it was a little unfortunate for me. But I think about that, you know, the very, very low expectation of that to where I find myself today. And that's why it stands out to me that we've got quite a big task.
I think that might be a good lead-in. We're going to have some questions from the floor, and there's one solitary student here today, Teresa. Teresa, would you like to ask your question? I know there is a microphone ready to... I'll get Greg, whose mission in life is to be the microphone person. And Teresa, did you want to address your question to anyone in particular on the panel?
Not really, just...
Okay, so it's grab, really, all right? No, let's hear the question and see.
Is this on?
Yes.
Okay.
Hold it like an ice cream.
We are very lucky to have a number of major religious traditions in our country represented here this afternoon. My question is this: more and more religion and people who profess religious beliefs are judged to be odd, and our religion's views are ignored, not respected, and even laughed at. How can young people such as myself, who try and follow their religious traditions, be confident professing and practicing their faith more openly without having to defend it every time we speak?
Do you want to have a go at that, Gersh?
Did you not see I was looking at the floor?
Oh, sorry. Let me put it to Adele then.
The first thing we have to do is recognise and be honest about that reality. Because unless adults start hearing that as the reality, they're not going to believe it. There are people sitting in this room who have had the antithesis lived experience. There are people in this room that might have grown up without a faith tradition and recall, perhaps in similar schools as the one you described, having to pick one of those classes to be in because there wasn't another option. And remember a time where there was religious coercion in this country. And so the first thing we need to do is recognize and give thanks for that shift. Because that shift allows us the ability to, with integrity, say, I'm not asking you to believe what I believe. I'm not asking you to do what I do, but I am asking you to respect me as a human being. And I'm more than happy to be in relationship with you and to learn about you and how you find meaning in life and to share with you who I am and how I find meaning in life. And if we can arrive at that place of dialogue, then from my perspective, the divine will be communing amongst us. And if one doesn't have a faith or belief in the divine, then we'll just be living in a much better place. But it begins and ends with honest recognition of the reality. And I don't think that we're quite there yet. I think that people in this room who are all engaged in the work of religious education, who don't necessarily agree with you. And if we don't, then how much more so many of the people in congregations, or for that matter, people who aren't in congregations and communities all over this country, haven't arrived at that reality yet.
Is that good? Beautiful, thank you. Does anyone want to add anything, or will we keep things moving?
Sorry, it just sort of occurs to me that I think that our students do feel that a lot, and I wonder whether our students are aware that actually there's a lot of people that are their teachers that feel the same pressure and sometimes the same anxieties and the same doubts living in the society that we live in. And I think that that's one of the challenges when it comes to religious education, that each individual is going through their own personal journey, and we have our ups and downs. And the difficulty is that it makes us a little, or it could make us a little like teachers that are not confident in their material. And I think sometimes when things shift in other areas of curriculum, we might say introduce, I don't know, new maths, a new way of doing something in a different curriculum area, and we're not so personally attached to it. But when things shift a little bit in a religious setting or understanding, then I think that becomes a harder thing to compartmentalise. And so, you know, it's good to know that we're all actually struggling through that same sort of challenge.
There's a beautiful saying by one of my favourite theologians about youth ministry, a man called Andrew Root from Princeton Theological Seminary, who says, "Pass on the faith through doubt and struggle. Don't be afraid to do this." There's courage there about being human, being fully human and not pretending to be across everything. Meredith Doig is here, and I'm wondering, Meredith, if you would like to introduce yourself and see who takes up your question from the panel. Thanks, Greg.
Thanks, Julie. Yes, my name is Meredith Doig, and I'm president of the Rationalist Society. So rationalists are, my elevator speech is that we're in favour of science and evidence as opposed to superstition and bigotry. And I would imagine that most people in this room would agree with us in that regard. Now, I was going to ask the question, well, let me just go a little bit further. The rationalists are one group amongst a number of groups that could be loosely called the free thought movement. And that would include atheists, agnostics, secularists, rationalists, humanists, and skeptics. Okay, and we have some similarities, commonalities amongst us, but some differences as well, as your religious faith traditions would have. I was going to ask a question, but Julie, if you'll indulge me, I'm just going to change it a little bit. I was going to ask a question about whether or not the people in this room who are committed to dialogue across faith boundaries would also include those of us who come from a non-faith background. But my sense in just listening so far is that that really wouldn't be a problem for the people in this room. But I have to say, being really honest, there are people outside of this room in the faith tradition who do have a problem dialoguing with those of us from a non-faith tradition. And I suspect that some of you, at least in this room, have some concerns about them within your own faith traditions. Not quite sure what sort of question this is leading to, but it's something along the lines that, are we not all engaged in trying to build cohesion in the I was going to say moderate middle. It's not quite like that. In the reasonable acknowledgement of one another's sets of ethics and values and morals, but deal with the extremists. Because it's the extremists in free thought movement that I don't agree with. But I would be interested to hear from the people on the panel, how do you deal with the extremists in your own faith tradition?
I'm wondering if we could have Helen and Adele to start us off on that.
I love that idea.
Yep. You just sit back and relax there, Gersh. Would you like to start, Helen?
Well, extremists in my own tradition. I should mention that interfaith ministers generally stay in their own tradition but learn about the other world religions and spiritualities. In my case, I put down on the census that I'm Anglican, and I went to an all-girls school in those days, St Michael's Church of England Girls Grammar School, which it was in St Kilda, with Sisters of the Church, but I feel at home in other traditions as well. Now, to answer the question about extremists, yes, in the Anglican tradition, there are extremists just as there are in every other tradition. I suppose I don't really come across them very much because of the nature of my work. What can we do? Well, I suppose we just need to do as much as we possibly can to break down a lot of prejudice, a lot of misunderstanding. But actually, when I think about it, people do change. I can think of when I was at university many years ago, and a friend of mine who was what you would call a very fundamentalist Christian who did not approve of me meditating at all, because if I did, you know, the devil might get me. And I think it was 2 years ago, I spent some days with her in another state, and she told me she'd just come back from America where she'd been on a wonderful meditation retreat. So we all do change, you know, over time. We see things differently as we mature. Apart from that, I can't really add anything about Anglican extremists.
Okay, thanks, Helen.
I think it's incumbent upon us to be clear about terms.
You just hold it a bit closer.
Yes, it's the ice cream.
Yeah.
The sons. We need to be clear about terms. What do we mean by an extremist? Is an extremist the same as a fundamentalist? Is an extremist someone who just holds extreme views, however we define extreme views? Or is it someone that holds these views and then somehow acts upon them? So I think the first challenge is really to be clear about terms. I can't possibly address all of those different contexts, but I'll come back to the question in the sense that for Muslims and Islam, the challenge of engaging with people who profess to be of the Islamic faith, who conduct themselves in a way that is not consistent with the mainstream understanding of Islam, is a real challenge, not only in Australia, but around the world, including, and maybe even especially, in predominantly Muslim countries. And if you follow world events, you will know that. You will know that there are very strong streams of disagreement within those societies. But if I bring it now to an Australian context, I've always found, Meredith, that the best antidote, if you like, to extreme views, and I'll define it as someone who holds the view that excludes others and seeks to forcefully impose their view on others. That's my definition of extremism or extremist thought. Not a fundamentalist, because a fundamentalist to me it can be someone who actually strongly believes in their faith and strongly believes that their faith is absolutely right and it is the faith tradition that they want to follow and they want their family to follow, and they believe that will lead them to salvation. I don't have a problem. In fact, I'm one of them. I strongly believe in the tenets of Islam. I'm a practicing Muslim. I live Islam. But they're not the people I'm referring to. I'm talking about people who hold these views that basically ridicules and demeans the views and the value of others. And I found that the best antidote to that is dialogue, and actually, to use the expression, call them out through debate and discussion. Proper Islamic scholarship is surely the best antidote to misguidance and ignorance within the Islamic faith. And what I've found, and I know that this is true because I've seen it, that when Muslim scholars, people who actually have solid religious knowledge, engage with people who have these extreme views in a discussion, they find that they're able to, I guess, dismantle the whole foundations of their arguments quite easily, because it's not difficult to do that, but you've got to get in the dialogue. Sometimes they're not willing to have that discussion with you. And that's part of them being extreme, because they actually want to exclude you. But if you're able to engage with them and have that dialogue, then I've found from my own experience and third-party experience, it's actually not difficult to dismantle the philosophical underpinnings of their argument and their views.
Thank you.
I just want to add one thing. How do people arrive? These groups that you referred to that exist within faith groups, as well as that exist within the free thought community. How do people arrive at these? Now you build on your definition at this these extreme positions. We aren't born there. That's the comment that you spoke about our earliest learners. We know how we're born. We arrive at a place because we're taken there. Taken there either because of the way we are taught, or taken there because of the limited exposure and experience that we've had, the things that we've experienced, both in their absence as well as in their practice. What is therefore the only antidote? Well, dialogue, education, conversation, but giving people lived experience, helping with that education that you speak about, calling them out. I love that use of that language. And honestly asking, what is it that you're afraid of? What is it that you're afraid of that's stopping you from joining in a conversation? I loved it when you provided that I think the phrase you used was the elevator definition, that soundbite, elevator speech on what I am and what I believe. But then you went to the more lengthy explanation, and you know, the rationalist, the humanist, the secularist. It sounds like calling roll in one of my Jewish studies classes. That we can accept all of these voices if we don't have fear. And ultimately it's fear of the other, usually driven by ignorance of the other, that is the greatest obstacle. And that is something that is held both within the faith communities as a general rule, specifically in individual faith communities, and then in the secular or free thought community, and then more particularly in what is increasingly becoming the majority of the Australian community, the silent majority, who don't have an opinion because they haven't been afforded the opportunity to develop one.
Yes, Janet.
To be friends with a friend of my husband on Facebook, who would be one of those free thought people who are exclusivist. I like this new word. And I've gone through this personal dilemma of, do I stay friends with this person when everything that they pose is absolutely derogatory towards my religious and my personal beliefs? And this is a personal dilemma that I've been going through, and I guess the conclusion that I it's still something that I'm wrestling with. But the conclusion that I came to, I think, reflects something that Gersh said, and that's really about understanding the story that comes behind that goes with that position. Where has that person come from, and how have they come to that position? And it's reminded me again and again in my own role of how important it is to understand the stories that shape us, and to consider carefully the stories that we share, and the stories that that come to mean something to us. And to ensure that we're not excluding others with our own story, I guess. But yeah, it's a real life dilemma.
Thank you. As I said, I think, where's Laurie? I've lost him. Laurie, because we're on the cusp of afternoon tea, and it's an ideal opportunity for people to be in conversation. I think you were going to talk to us about a conference coming up, is that?
Yes. Just if I can add that I'm really excited by all of this, and I'm looking forward to questions that Julie is going to invite people to ask afterwards too, that will continue our discussion. I think it's fantastic. Just to say that AARE are planning a conference in September at holidays next year. It's going to be called I Connect, I Discover, I Am, and it's all about working with young people about questions of religious education and the challenges that we face in terms of the future. We're very excited about the conference. We've got Waleed Ali is going to be a keynote speaker. He'll be addressing this question with us in terms of communication with young people about questions of religion. And then also we've got Barry McGaw, Chair of ACARA, who's going to be speaking about the role of the national curriculum and all of the possibilities there. And we've got other keynote speakers. So we hope that we can, as an organisation, continue this discussion and possibly engage our panellists and others here today, and hopefully many, many more, in terms of this whole question about the place of religious education into Australia's future. So just a warning will be, not a warning, an announcement. We'll be formally announcing the conference in the coming holidays. A warning that we've got to be organised to get it out. It's a warning
be
to
alert,
myself.
but not alarmed.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julie.
Yeah, so thank you. And my sense of it is that people have still got some listening energy left in the room. So will we make it quite a short morning tea? So 10 minutes? Even less. Okay, I'll ring the bell after 5 and you can get yourselves back here and we'll keep going.